Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human research and written material.
It is so good to be here.
So almost everything you are currently doing to secure your happiness is, mathematically speaking, guaranteed to make you miserable.
Yeah, it's a pretty jarring premise to start with.
It really is. I mean, we spend our entire lives under this assumption that if we can just acquire enough security, accumulate enough resources, surround ourselves with the right people,
Build that perfect little fortress.
Right. We try to build this impregnable fortress of peace. We treat happiness like it's an addition problem. Like if I just add this one more thing, I'll be happy.
But the ancient wisdom we're looking at today basically argues that this instinct is completely backward.
Entirely backward. So for this deep dive, we are jumping into chapters 13 through 16 of the Dhammapada.
Which is, just a massive cornerstone text of Eastern philosophy.
Exactly. And we're covering the chapters categorized as the world, the Buddha, happiness, and pleasure. And our goal here isn't just to, casually skim some nice ancient poetry.
No, absolutely not.
We are here to dismantle the actual psychological architecture of our modern anxieties using a text that diagnosed these exact problems, 2.5 millennia ago?
Yeah, roughly 2,500 years ago.
Yeah.
And the diagnosis they give it is severe. I think that's why it remains so incredibly relevant today.
Right.
Because this text, it promises something it calls the highest happiness. But the price of admission, it's basically the systematic destruction of your current worldview.
So it's not offering like a top 10 list of stress reduction techniques?
Not at all. It's not a coping mechanism.
Right.
The author is offering a complete neurological and psychological rewrite of how we interact with desire, reality, and, other human beings.
Okay, let's unpack this, because I think we need to start by defining the baseline reality that this author believes we're currently trapped in.
Yes. The diagnosis before the cure.
Exactly. Before we can talk about the cure, we have to really understand the disease.
Yeah.
And my reading of chapters 13 and 14 suggests that the author views average human existence as essentially a state of active hallucination.
That's a great way to phrase it.
Because in verse 170, it literally instructs the reader to look upon the world as a bubble, look upon it as a mirage.
Yeah.
And then verse 171 follows up with this invitation. It says, "Come, look at this glittering world, like unto a royal chariot. The foolish are immersed in it, but the wise do not touch it."
Right.
So my hypothesis here is that the author is describing a fundamental failure of perception. We look at social hierarchies, wealth, status games.
The glittering chariots.
The glittering chariots, exactly. And our brains process them as these solid, permanent, life or death realities. But the text is insisting they're structurally identical to a bubble.
What's fascinating here is that the bubble metaphor is actually remarkably precise if you consider the physics of it.
Okay, how so?
Well, think about a bubble. It has surface tension that gives it a defined shape,
Yeah.
right? And it reflects light brilliantly. It's captivating to look at. But the core of it is entirely hollow.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
It relies on this really delicate, temporary equilibrium of outside forces just to exist.
Yeah.
And the moment that equilibrium shifts even slightly...
It pops. It vanishes completely.
Exactly. And the text is arguing that our social constructs, our reputational status, our material acquisitions, they all operate on those exact same physics.
They're hyper-reflective, but completely hollow.
Right. And the foolish are immersed in this because human neurobiology is basically wired to respond to salience. We pay attention to what glitters.
We can't help it.
Yeah. And notice the text uses the word immersed. In this context, that implies a sort of cognitive capture. Your entire operating system is hijacked by the exhausting task of maintaining and defending this bubble.
I mean, that concept of cognitive capture perfectly explains the baseline exhaustion of modern life, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Because we aren't just casually participating in the economy or the social sphere anymore. We are consumed by them. Think about the mechanics of algorithmic curation in our digital lives today.
It's the ultimate glittering royal chariot.
It really is. It's this beautifully curated social media feed. It presents this hyper reality, this seamlessly edited stream of success and beauty and, outrage that just demands your participation.
And it feels so urgent.
Yes, it feels incredibly urgent, so you dive into it. But the wise, according to verse 171, they do not touch it.
Right.
And that phrasing really challenged me. Does the author truly mean we should just I don't know, check out of society entirely, run to the woods?
Oh.
Or is not touching it more of a metaphor for a specific psychological posture?
It's definitely a psychological posture. Specifically, it's the posture of non-identification.
Non-identification. Okay, break that down for me.
So not touching it means you refuse to let your internal state be dictated by the fluctuations of the external world. You can observe the glittering chariot. You might even have to interact with the people driving it at work or whatever.
Right, you still have a job and a family.
Exactly. But you don't tether your identity to it. Verse 174 actually reinforces this. It describes the world as a place where very few can truly see, and it says the wise escape, like birds escape from the net.
A net, okay.
Think about how a net functions. It uses a creature's own momentum against it. The harder a bird struggles and fights against the physical threads, the more entangled it becomes.
Oh, that makes so much sense. So the worldly net is made up of our own reactions.
Yes, our reactive impulses. When we react with anger or greed or this desperate attachment to the mirage, we're just thrashing in the net.
We're tangling ourselves up worse.
Precisely. Escaping requires this counterintuitive stillness. It requires realizing that the threads are only holding you because you're trying so hard to grab them or fight them.
Wow. Okay, so if the first step is recognizing the net and refusing to grab those threads, the natural consequence of that has to be a massive shift in how we define a successful life.
Which brings us right into chapter 15.
Right. Chapter 15 focuses on happiness. And this is where the text just completely flips the script on what makes a good life.
It really does. Because our default operating system says happiness is achieved by engineering our environment.
Yeah. We think if I'm surrounded by hostile people, I need to conquer them or escape them. If I'm surrounded by scarcity, I need to hoard resources. We're constantly trying to outcompete our environment.
But the text proposes a model of happiness that is entirely uncoupled from the environment.
It's not about gaining things. It's about living without.
Living without. Okay, talk to me about those specific verses because they are wild.
They're a profound declaration of psychological sovereignty, honestly. Chapter 15 lays out a blueprint for a mind that cannot be colonized by external circumstances. So, verse 197 states, "Let us live happily then, not hating those who hate us. Among men who hate us, let us dwell free from hatred." Which sounds impossible.
It continues, right. Verse 198 advises us to live free from ailments among the ailing. And verse 199 says to live free from greed among the greedy.
So it's just systematically eliminating every single excuse we use to justify our misery.
Exactly. We usually argue, my anger is justified, or my anxiety is a rational response to this toxic environment.
You'd be stressed too if you worked where I work.
Right. But the author completely denies this. They're arguing that your internal state is a choice, totally, regardless of the toxicity going on around you.
See, I see the appeal of that kind of sovereignty, but the actual mechanics of achieving it seems nearly impossible for modern humans.
It's definitely an uphill battle.
Because we are highly social primates. Our nervous systems are literally biologically designed to co-regulate with the people around us.
Yes, mirror neurons and all of that.
Oh, right. If someone in the room is panicked, my heart rate elevates. If someone is aggressive, my amygdala floods my system with cortisol to get me ready for a fight. We absorb the psychological temperature of the room.
We do.
And the text is demanding that we sever that biological feedback loop. It's asking you to stand in a room full of panic and greed and just remain fundamentally untouched.
It is difficult. And it's difficult precisely because it requires overriding millions of years of evolutionary programming.
Yeah.
Evolution optimized us for survival, right? Not for tranquility.
That's a great point.
Survival requires you to be highly reactive to the hatred and greed of others so you can protect your resources. But the author of the Dhammapada recognized something huge. While this reactivity might keep you alive, it makes the actual experience of living a waking nightmare.
You just become a hostage to the lowest common denominator in whatever room you walk into.
Exactly. If you require your neighbors to be peaceful before you can feel peaceful, you have essentially sublet your emotional state to people you cannot control.
Oh, I love that phrasing, subletting your emotional state. It's so true. So how do we break the loop?
Well, the mechanism is right there in verse 200. It says, "Let us live happily then, though we call nothing our own. We shall be like the bright gods feeding on happiness."
Calling nothing our own. That's the leverage point right there.
Yes.
Because the reason we mirror the hatred and greed of our environment is because we have all these assets we're terrified of losing.
Material and psychological assets.
Right. If I identify super deeply with my reputation and you attack my reputation, I have to respond with hatred to defend my property. If I consider my wealth to be my core identity, I have to become greedy when surrounded by competitors.
Because you're under threat.
Exactly. My hypothesis here is that ownership, and I won't just mean physical objects, but ownership of opinions, status, grudges, that ownership is the surface area where the world can grab us.
Wow.
So if you shrink your surface area of ownership down to zero, the world suddenly has nothing to grip.
That is an incredibly precise way to articulate the mechanism.
Yeah.
Really. The text refers to feeding on happiness, what you call nothing your own.
Yeah, what does that mean, feeding on happiness?
Well, think about how much energy you expend every day just defending your psychological territory.
Oh, a ton. It's exhausting.
Right. So when you abandon that desperate project of defense, all that energy is suddenly freed up. And that reclaimed energy is experienced as this profound, luminous lightness.
You're not happy because you won?
No. You aren't happy because you finally won the game. You're happy because you realized you don't actually have to play it. You can literally just watch the greedy scramble for that glittering chariot and politely decline to participate.
Okay. To really stress test this philosophy, though, I think we have to examine the historical and human context it actually emerged from.
Absolutely necessary.
Because it is so tempting for a modern listener to hear this and just dismiss it as, the luxury of an ancient, simpler time. Oh, sure, it was easy to call nothing your own when you were just hanging out under a tree in agrarian India.
Right, they didn't have a mortgage.
Exactly. But that assumption completely misunderstands the brutal realities of the ancient world. So what was going on back then? Were people really just wandering into the woods hoping a tree would solve their anxiety?
The assumption of ancient simplicity is just a modern conceit. It really is. The cultural landscape the author was addressing was characterized by intense urbanization, the consolidation of these massive ruthless monarchies, and the total breakdown of traditional tribal safety nets.
So it was hyper-competitive.
Hyper-competitive and deeply unstable. We actually see this reflected directly in the text. Verse 178 refers to the reward of sovereignty over the earth and lordship over all worlds.
Okay, so they were obsessed with ultimate power.
Yes. The author is speaking to a society that idealized absolute despotic power. The ultimate cultural goal was to conquer, to subjugate, and to extract wealth. And the violence required to maintain that kind of sovereignty was just staggering.
So the pursuit of power and status back then was just as relentless, if not way more brutal, than our modern corporate or political landscapes today.
Easily. And alongside that secular ambition, the text points to this pervasive, desperate fear among the general population.
You notice that verse 188 observes, "Men, driven by fear, go to many a refuge, to mountains and forests, to groves and sacred trees."
Which indicates a society that is highly aware of its own fragility. I mean, without modern medicine, a minor infection was literally a death sentence.
A bad harvest meant the whole village starves.
Exactly. Famines wiping out entire regions. So the unpredictability of life generated this constant low-grade terror, and their mechanism for coping with that terror was magical thinking.
Yes. Magical thinking is basically the brain's attempt to exert control over a completely uncontrollable environment.
So they'd run to the sacred trees.
Right. By creating these complex rituals, assigning a sacred status to groves, seeking refuge in superstitions, they were just trying to negotiate with the chaos of existence.
They could deal with the universe.
Exactly. And the author of the Dhammapada is performing this radical critique of that psychological defense mechanism. They're observing that running to a sacred tree does not actually cure the fundamental terror of mortality.
It's just a Band-Aid.
It just masks it temporarily. And furthermore, the text delivers this really scathing critique of the religious institutions that profited off that fear. Yes, verse 184 calls out the religious hypocrisy. It specifically mentions the anchorite, or ascetic, who strikes and insults others.
Which is such a powerful image.
It really is. It highlights individuals who wanted all the outward aesthetics of spiritual mastery. The robes, the isolation, the performative poverty, but whose internal machinery was still entirely driven by ego, anger, and this desire to dominate other people.
It's a timeless critique.
Completely timeless. We see the exact same architecture today in the wellness industry or in certain spiritual communities where the pursuit of quote-unquote enlightenment just becomes another status game.
It becomes another glittering chariot.
Exactly. So the author is basically systematically burning down every external refuge the culture relied on. The secular pursuit of kingly power, that's a trap. Worshipping nature out of fear. Useless, performative religion, hypocritical.
And having dismantled all those external refuges, the text then has to offer a viable alternative.
Right, it can't just leave us with nothing.
No, and this is where it introduces its core technology for understanding and dismantling human suffering. In verse 190, it points the reader to the four holy truths.
Okay.
And it is so crucial to unpack the mechanics of these truths because they really form the foundational logic of the entire philosophy we're talking about today.
Let's do it. Let's break down the causal framework of those four holy truths because the text references them as the ultimate turning point for the wise.
Okay, so my understanding is that the first truth is essentially an unfiltered assessment of reality. Existence is characterized by friction, unsatisfactoriness, and pain.
Just a baseline acceptance that things are going to be difficult.
Yes. Then the second truth identifies the root cause of that friction. And it insists that it isn't bad luck. It isn't the gods punishing you.
It's internal.
Exactly. It is the human mechanism of craving. It's our relentless biological demand that the world conform to our specific desires.
And that craving is the engine of the net we discussed earlier.
Bingo. The third truth is just the logical consequence of the first two. If craving causes the friction, then the cessation of craving will end the friction.
Makes mathematical sense.
And then the fourth truth is the applied methodology for actually achieving that cessation, which the text summarizes really elegantly in verse 183.
Oh, I have that one right here. It says, not to commit any sin, to do good, and to purify one's mind. That is the teaching of all the awakened.
Yeah.
That verse is fascinating to me because it just completely demystifies the entire spiritual project. It removes the need for the sacred groves or the complex rituals and just reduces the whole path to radical self-responsibility.
Purify one's mind.
Right, purify one's mind. The responsibility for your salvation or your peace rests entirely on your ability to clean up your own internal cognitive processes.
It requires a massive shift in your locus of control.
Yes, you stop blaming the world for not satisfying you, and you start actively examining the machinery of your own demands. Okay, I want to pivot here and translate this ancient framework directly into our 21st century realities. Because while we might not be worshiping sacred groves today, the specific objects of our craving have changed, but the underlying mechanism is identical.
Oh, entirely identical. We just have better technology for it now.
Right. So let's look at verse 186. It says, there is no satisfying lusts, even by a shower of gold pieces. He who knows that lusts have a short taste and cause pain, he is wise.
A shower of gold pieces.
The ultimate fantasy of sudden, infinite resource acquisition.
It is. It's the ancient equivalent of winning the lottery. Or, successfully taking a tech startup public or going completely viral and getting internet famous overnight.
It's the, if I just hit this milestone, my life is set fantasy.
Exactly. It's the deeply held belief that a sudden, massive influx of external validation or wealth will permanently alter our internal baseline of happiness.
But the text explicitly states there is no satisfying the craving mechanism through acquisition.
None at all.
And we actually see this validated constantly in modern behavioral economics and neuroscience. The brain is effectively a prediction engine, and it runs on dopamine.
Right.
So when you acquire that shower of gold, whatever it is for you, you experience this massive dopamine spike. That's the short taste the verse is describing.
The initial rush.
But then the brain immediately updates its predictive model. The new wealth or the new status just becomes the new baseline expectation.
The hedonic treadmill.
Exactly, the hedonic treadmill. Within months, the thrill evaporates completely, and the brain starts demanding an even larger stimulus to generate the exact same dopamine response.
And the text recognized this mechanism thousands of years before we had fMRI machines. It states that craving has a short taste and causes pain.
And the pain is the withdrawal.
Yes, the pain is the realization that the goal didn't actually fix existential dread, so it leaves you feeling more desperate and empty than you were before you got it.
So what's the countermeasure?
The author provides it in verse 204. They write, health is the greatest of gifts, contentedness the best riches.
Contentedness as the best riches.
Yes. By defining contentedness as the highest form of wealth, the text is completely upending the modern economic paradigm.
Which is entirely built on discontent.
Exactly. Our entire global economy is predicated on the deliberate manufacture of discontent. Advertising, social media, consumer culture, they're all highly optimized systems designed to convince you that your current baseline is unacceptable.
You always need the next upgrade.
Right. So to actively choose contentment in a society that literally monetizes your dissatisfaction. That is an act of profound intellectual rebellion.
It's a manifesto for radical contentment.
It means stepping off the treadmill and refusing to let external entities dictate your value.
But that rebellion becomes even more complex and, frankly, more difficult when we look at how we navigate conflict and competition in the modern world.
Oh, definitely.
Let's look at verse 201. It tackles this directly, and I think it is one of the most abrasive verses for a modern achiever to process. It says, "Victory breeds hatred, for the conquered is unhappy. He who has given up both victory and defeat, he, the contented, is happy."
Yeah, that's a tough one to swallow.
It is, because we operate in a culture where victory is the absolute highest metric of success. Whether it's crushing a rival company or, destroying an opponent in a political debate or just dominating some social hierarchy in your friend group.
We truly believe that holding the winning position secures our safety.
We do. But the text utilizes what is essentially game theory to demonstrate why the pursuit of victory is structurally flawed from the start.
How so?
Well, when you engage in zero-sum competition where your game absolutely requires someone else's loss, you're entering a cycle of perpetual vulnerability. Victory breeds hatred.
Because the person you beat doesn't just disappear.
Exactly. When you conquer someone, you do not eliminate them. You simply transform them into an enemy who is now actively plotting their return to power. So the psychological cost of holding the winning position is this constant, draining paranoia required to defend it. You literally have to sleep with one eye open. The conquered is unhappy, and their unhappiness becomes your permanent security threat.
Wow. And I mean, you look at the state of modern discourse, and it is a perfect illustration of this verse.
Oh, 100%. And I want to be clear here for the listener. We are not taking sides on any modern political issue right now.
No, not at all.
We are merely observing the mechanics of how the modern drive to conquer our ideological opponents only breeds the exact unhappiness the text warns about. We are obsessed with ideological conquest.
People will spend hours online just trying to intellectually humiliate those who disagree with them.
Believing that if they can just ratio their opponent or expose their flaws, they will somehow win the culture war.
But the mechanism of public humiliation only hardens the opposition. It practically guarantees that the conflict will escalate.
Exactly. And the text suggests that the game itself is the problem. He who has given up both victory and defeat is happy.
Which requires a massive ego death.
It does. You have to be willing to walk away from the board while people are actively calling you a coward or a loser, knowing internally that their game only leads to mutual destruction.
Giving up victory means recognizing that the validation you're seeking from dominating another human being is a mirage.
Yeah.
It's just another bubble.
Another hollow bubble.
Right. When you no longer need to see yourself reflected in the defeat of your enemies, you achieve a level of autonomy that makes you basically untouchable by the petty squabbles of the world.
Okay, so knowing all of this, knowing the translation to our modern lives, how do we actually operationalize this?
Right. What's the practical application?
Yeah. We've outlined the philosophy, but we need to derive the practical mechanics. How does a modern listener, someone who is fully embedded in the noise and the competition of the 21st century, actually apply these insights today?
Based on the text, there are a few very specific practices we can extract.
Okay, let's hear them.
The first practice is what I would call the deliberate exposure to the default mode network. And this is based on verses 185 and 205.
The default mode network. Okay, explain that.
So verse 185 advises us to sleep and sit alone and to dwell on the highest thoughts. And verse 205 praises the sweetness of solitude and tranquility.
Right.
Now, most of us go to extreme lengths to avoid sitting alone in silence. When we are forced into silence, the brain's default mode network kicks in. And for modern people, it usually starts generating anxiety, replaying past regrets, or just catastrophizing about the future.
Silence actually hurts initially. It's incredibly uncomfortable.
It hurts because silence removes the external stimuli that we use to distract ourselves from our own unresolved psychological friction.
Wow. Yeah, when you remove the noise of the podcast or the TV or the endless scrolling.
You're finally forced to confront the contents of your own mind, and it's messy in there.
So what's the action step for the listener?
The practice the text is advocating is not simply physical isolation. It's the intentional, sustained observation of your own mental machinery. By sitting alone and refusing to numb the discomfort, you eventually exhaust the frantic energy of that default mode network.
The anxiety basically burns itself out.
Exactly. And what remains is the sweetness of tranquility the verse talks about. you discover that your baseline consciousness, once it's stripped of all its artificial demands, is inherently peaceful.
So, challenge to the listener. When was the last time you sat completely alone without your phone, without background noise, and just tasted that sweetness of solitude?
It's a game changer.
Okay, what's the second practice?
The second practice involves real-time cognitive diffusion, and this draws from verse 170's instruction to look upon the world as a bubble.
Cognitive diffusion, that's a term from modern therapy, right?
Yes. It's a technique used in modern psychological therapies where you learn to separate yourself from your thoughts and from external events.
Okay, so how does it work in practice?
Well, think about when a crisis hits, say a massive failure at work or a sudden social media outrage cycle. Your immediate physiological response is immersion. Your brain signals that this is a permanent, life-threatening catastrophe.
Everything feels like it's on fire.
Right. The practice is to intervene at that exact moment of panic and consciously apply the bubble label to the situation.
Oh, literally calling it a bubble in your mind.
Yes. The mechanism of labeling is incredibly powerful because it shifts neurological activity away from the emotional centers of the brain, the amygdala, and moves it into the prefrontal cortex, which handles logic and executive function.
So when you consciously identify the crisis as a bubble, you're acknowledging that it's currently high pressure, but you're simultaneously asserting its impermanence.
Exactly. You remind yourself of the physics we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
It's loud, it's shiny, it's demanding all your attention right now, but it is structurally hollow and it will inevitably pop.
That is so practical. Because it doesn't mean you just ignore the crisis at work, right?
Yeah, you still have to deal with it.
But it means you manage it from a position of detached clarity rather than panicked reactivity.
Precisely. You don't let it dictate your internal state.
Okay, that brings us to the third practice. And this one requires a pretty ruthless audit of our mimetic environment.
The good network.
Yes, cultivating the good network. This is based on verses 206 through 208. The text states that company with fools is like an enemy and always painful. But company with the wise is like meeting with kinsfolk.
I love that comparison.
It concludes by advising the reader to follow a good and wise man as the moon follows the path of the stars. We often vastly underestimate how permeable our minds actually are.
We think we're these independent thinkers.
Right, but we are highly susceptible to mimetic contagion, the transfer of ideas, anxieties, and behavioral norms from the people around us.
And in the modern context, company extends way beyond just physical proximity.
Oh, absolutely.
Your company includes the algorithms you train. It includes the content creators you watch, the digital communities you inhabit. If your primary inputs every day are driven by outrage, cynicism, and status anxiety.
You're walking with fools.
Yes. And your neural pathways will physically rewire themselves to prioritize those toxic states.
Yeah.
You are actively inviting enemies into your cognitive space.
So the action step here is to ruthlessly curate your inputs. You have to actively sever ties with the sources of noise that degrade your focus and amplify your fears. Stop doom scrolling. Stop engaging with toxic people.
And intentionally orient yourself toward the wise. Seek out inputs that challenge your assumptions, promote deep thinking, and model that radical contentment the text advocates for.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Because those three practices, sitting in silence, labeling the bubbles, curating our mimetic environment, those are challenging, sure, but they're generally acceptable to a modern audience. They fit pretty neatly into the category of, like, rigorous self-improvement.
They're palatable.
Right. But we have to address chapter 16 now. And this chapter contains the absolute most jarring countercultural obstacle in the entire text. We can't just take the easy parts of the text. We have to face the parts that directly attack our deepest modern values.
The scandal of anti-attachment.
Yes, it forces us into a highly uncomfortable debate. Verses 211 through 216 systematically attack the very concept of human love and affection.
It is definitely shocking on the first read.
Listen to this progression. Let no man love anything. Loss of the beloved is evil. From pleasure comes grief. From pleasure comes fear. From affection comes grief. From love comes grief. From love comes fear. He who is free from love knows neither grief nor fear.
Yeah.
I have to push back aggressively on this premise.
I expected you would.
I mean, from the standpoint of evolutionary biology, attachment is the fundamental mechanism of human survival and flourishing. Modern culture tells us love is the absolute highest good. Mammalian neurochemistry is literally built on oxytocin and the deep bonds between parent and child, or between partners. So to declare that loss of the beloved is evil and therefore we should love nothing, that seems like a catastrophic misunderstanding of what it means to be human. It sounds cold. It sounds like the philosophy of a sociopath who is just trying to inoculate themselves against the pain of existence by amputating the best part of the human experience.
A lot of listeners will instantly reject this, and for good reason.
If the price of this highest happiness is emotional sterilization, I think most people should reject it.
This raises a really important question.
Yeah.
And your pushback is entirely justified. It's the necessary reaction of anyone who is deeply engaged with the human experience. But to understand these verses, we have to look past the provocative translation and examine the precise psychological mechanism the author is diagnosing here.
Okay, I'm listening.
The text is not advocating for sociopathy or the destruction of care. The conflict we're feeling arises from our modern definition of the word love. In the modern West, we have completely conflated love with identification and possession.
Conflating love with possession. Okay.
When the text says, "From love comes fear," it is describing a very specific type of attachment where you locate your core identity and your ultimate safety in a mortal, transient object or person.
Oh.
Think of it in terms of financial markets. When you attach your profoundest well-being to something that is biologically guaranteed to change or die, you are essentially trading on margin.
Trading on margin emotionally.
Yes, you are borrowing emotional capital you do not actually have against an asset whose value and lifespan is completely out of your control.
Wow. So the argument is that this specific type of love is fundamentally a refusal to accept the reality of impermanence.
Precisely. The text actually refers to this type of love as a fetter in verse 211, a chain.
A chain.
Yes. When you demand that your partner or your child or your career remain exactly as they are just to ensure your happiness, you are not actually loving them.
You're holding them hostage.
You're holding them hostage to your own existential terror. The grief and the fear the text warns about are the inevitable margin calls.
The margin calls, that is a brutally clarifying metaphor.
When the beloved inevitably changes or leaves or passes away, the margin call comes due, and it bankrupts you psychologically. The author is just pointing out the mathematical certainty of this suffering. Attachment to the impermanent guarantees fear of loss, which eventually guarantees grief.
Okay, if I love my child, but my love is defined by a desperate, clinging need to control all their outcomes just so I don't have to feel the pain of their potential failure, I'm operating out of fear, not love.
Exactly. The attachment isn't about their flourishing at all. It's entirely about your emotional security.
But this requires an incredibly high level of discernment from the listener. How do we navigate the space between a healthy, expansive appreciation for the people in our lives and the toxic margin trading attachment the text condemns? We can't just toss the baby out with the bathwater and sever all relationships.
No, and the text itself provides the nuance required for this discernment. It proves it isn't entirely anti-relationship. Look at verse 204 again. It states, "Trust is the best of relationships."
Trust, not possession.
Exactly. That is a critical distinction. Trust requires an open hand. It's the willing acceptance of vulnerability without the demand for control. You can appreciate, support, and profoundly care for someone while simultaneously recognizing that they do not belong to you.
Their ultimate trajectory is outside your jurisdiction.
Yes. And furthermore, verse 219 uses this deeply human, incredibly joyful image. It says, "Kinsmen, friends, and lovers, salute a man who has been long away and returns safe from afar."
Oh, a reunion.
Right. And in the very next verse, it uses this joy of a homecoming reunion as the ultimate metaphor for the reception of a good person in the next world.
Yeah.
Think about it. An author advocating for cold, sterile isolation would never use the warmth of returning lovers as a metaphor for spiritual triumph.
That distinction changes everything for me. So what does this all mean for you, the listener? It means the author isn't anti-relationship, they are anti-suffocation.
Beautifully said.
It's the difference between a clenched fist and an open hand. You can love your family, your friends, your life, you can hold the beauty of the world. But the moment you clench your fist to capture it, you crush the very thing you're trying to hold.
And you chain yourself to the fear of losing it.
Exactly. The wisdom here is to navigate that tension. Enjoy the sweetness of life and relationships without being immersed in the trap of clinging to them out of vanity or fear. You actually love them better because you aren't placing the impossible burden of your own salvation on their shoulders.
Spot on.
So when we zoom out a bit, looking at the philosophical architecture of these 4 chapters, it's striking how this specific diagnosis of the human condition really resonates across vastly different eras and cultures.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the universality of this struggle is probably the most compelling evidence for its validity. In verses 202 and 203, the text states, There is no fire like passion. There is no losing throw like hatred. Hunger is the worst of diseases, the body the greatest of pains. This visceral confrontation with the vulnerability of the physical form and the tyranny of desire, it's echoed throughout all of global philosophy.
Like the Stoics.
Exactly. Consider the Stoics of ancient Rome. Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius were absolutely obsessed with the dichotomy of control.
The idea that suffering arises exclusively from attaching our desires to things outside our control.
Yes, or consider the 19th century pessimism of Arthur Schopenhauer. He argued that human life basically swings like a pendulum between the pain of unfulfilled desire and the profound boredom that immediately follows its fulfillment.
It's the exact same observation.
Or the 20th century existentialists grappling with the absurd friction of seeking meaning in a completely indifferent universe. Across thousands of years, the brightest minds have all looked at the human operating system and concluded that our default settings are basically calibrated for suffering.
And while their metaphysical frameworks differ wildly, the practical prescriptions they all arrive at are remarkably convergent.
Yes, they are.
Whether it's the Stoic pursuit of apatheia, or the existentialist leap into authentic action, or the Dhammapada's path to awakening, the highest wisdom almost always resolves into radical, grounded simplicity.
Which brings us right back to verse 183.
Yes. After all this incredibly complex analysis of psychological states and attachment and the illusion of reality, the ultimate supernatural achievement, becoming awakened, is rooted in such grounded moral action. Not to commit any sin, to do good, and to purify one's mind.
It is the ultimate grounding mechanism. It strips away all the pretension of spiritual achievement. You do not need to decipher the secrets of the cosmos to escape the net.
Right.
You simply need to regulate your own conduct. You stop introducing unnecessary harm into the system. You perform actions that reduce friction for others. And you relentlessly observe and clean the lens of your own perception.
It's a profoundly democratic view of enlightenment.
It's accessible to anyone willing to do the unglamorous daily work of internal hygiene.
It brings this entire massive philosophical structure right out of the clouds and places it directly in front of you. You don't need a sacred grove. You just need to stop letting your ego dictate your reactions in your next meeting at work.
Exactly.
You just need to stop trading on margin with the people you love.
Yes.
Well, we have dismantled a lot of comfortable illusions today. We've looked at the world as a hollow bubble. We've redefined happiness as the absolute reduction of craving, confronted the zero-sum trap of victory, and wrestled with the terrifying freedom of non-attachment.
It is a heavy, demanding philosophy.
It is. And it's easy to look at the sheer scale of the cognitive rewrite required here and feel a sense of despair. You might examine your own life right now, the grudges you hold, the status you fiercely protect, the margin calls you are terrified of, and conclude that you're just far too entangled in the net to ever achieve the tranquility this text promises.
But the author anticipates that.
They do. And I want to leave you with one final, provocative image from the text that completely undermines that despair. It's a mechanism of immediate accessible redemption found in verses 172 and 173.
It's a beautiful image.
The text says, "He who formerly was reckless and afterwards became sober brightens up this world, like the moon when freed from clouds. He whose evil deeds are covered by good deeds brightens up this world like the moon when freed from clouds."
The physics of that metaphor are crucial.
Right, because the clouds do not destroy the moon, they merely obscure it. Your past recklessness, your current anxieties, your deep immersion in that glittering chariot, none of these things have actually altered your fundamental capacity for clarity. They're just clouds.
They're transient.
Completely. The moment you decide to stop grabbing the threads of the net, the moment you choose to apply the bubble perspective and open your clenched fist, the wind shifts. You do not have to build a new moon, you simply have to let the clouds pass.
Your path does not permanently corrupt your operating system.
Exactly. No matter how caught in the net you are right now, the capacity to brighten the world exists within you, intact and waiting the very moment you choose to be sober. Your past does not dictate your awakening.
It's a profound promise.
That's the heart of this section. This is wisdom for the present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.